All right, welcome back to World History, Unit 5, Video 4. We are getting into the Roman civilization today. So let's start at the beginning of Roman civilization. Um, let me preface it a little bit. Think about this. If today you travel in Spain, France, Britain, Italy, Greece, and Asian Minor, and Egypt and Palestine or North Africa, you could find roads built. Um, just a second. This is what I want. You can find roads built almost 2,000 years ago by the Romans. And in fact, some of the modern day roads that are in these countries are built on top of the firm and deep base of old Roman roads. The Romans constructed a network of roads that connected the far corners of their vast empire with their capital city. This has led to the saying, all roads lead to Rome. And in a figurative sense, the road of ancient Western history also leads us to Rome. Rome was the culmination of ancient Western civilization. Despite its power and influence, Rome was deeply bound in spiritual darkness, though. It readily embraced the pagan gods and false teachings of its many conquered peoples. The road of God's plan for the ages also led us to Rome. God chose to send his son, Jesus Christ, into the world when the Roman civilization was at its height. God had been at work in history preparing the world for the coming Savior. And it could be said that the Roman world was the cradle of Christianity. From the Roman province of Judea, the truth of the gospel spread to every part of the empire on the Roman roads. So this map should look familiar to you. This is the map that you completed right before fall break. Um, and you can see the great expansion of the Roman Empire. And in this particular map, you can see the Christianized areas and the strongly Christianized areas, and then missionary spots and Christian communities. And what you start to notice is Christianity literally was just as far as the Roman Empire's borders were. And then you start to look at the deep purple areas and you go, wow, there was so many different areas um, that Christianity was thriving in. And you can even see some of the old city names where we know Paul wrote letters to, right? And this is a pretty cool map for us to be able to see all like the immediate impact of Christ's death on the cross and his ministry when he was here on earth. So here we go. We're going to move a little bit more into the geographic features. So the land of Italy is centrally located in the Mediterranean world, and it's considered the heart of the Roman Empire. It's shaped like a boot. We all kind of know that. The Italian peninsula is, and extends into the Mediterranean Sea between the lands of Greece and Spain. And at the southern tip of Italy is the island of Sicily, which nearly joins Italy with North Africa. Geographic obstacles did not hamper the Romans, though, as they did the Greeks. Because of the lack of good soil, the Greeks looked to the sea for their livelihood. However, the soil and climate in Italy was much more suitable for farming. Remember how the mountains in Greece divided the Greek people and hindered their political unity? Well, the Apennines Mountains, which are located in the middle of the Italian peninsula, are way less rugged than the mountains in Greece, and they did not hamper the growth of trade and travel among the people in Italy. So the Romans expanded their territory uh, far beyond the peninsula to include all the lands surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. And it's no wonder that the Romans would later call the Mediterranean Sea Mare Nostrum, which means our sea. So the early inhabitants of the Italian peninsula had crossed the Alps and settled in northern Italy, and many of these early settlers, called Latins, moved south and settled in Latium. And it was a plain that was really close to the Tiber River, which is in the middle of the boot. And from this region, there arose a lot of different civilizations, and then eventually one that would rule the entire Mediterranean world. So portions of Italy were also inhabited by the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Etruscans. Both the Phoenicians and the Greeks were known in the ancient world for their sea trade and colonization. Phoenicia even established colonies in Sicily and in North Africa. Remember, the Phoenician colonies of Carthage in North Africa would later kind of be the rival of the Romans. But even though you've probably heard of the Phoenicians and the Greeks um, and all Phoenicians and Greeks, I don't think you probably know much about the Etruscans. Most people have never heard of them, but they came to Italy around 800 BC and established one of Italy's earliest civilizations. We don't know much about its origin, and some historians believe they came from the east, possibly Asia Minor. The Etruscans settled along Italy's western coast, close to the Tiber River, and they soon became trade competitors with the Greeks living in Italy. The Etruscans learned much about the Greek myths, architecture, and sculpture and language, and it's even possible that they were the first to introduce Greeks to Romans. Um, but eventually, they were the connection between Rome and Greece, and Rome would also take on some of the Greek cultures and traditions. So, the founding of the city of Rome. The city of Rome began on the banks of the Tiber River, and it's about 15 miles from the coast, the ocean coastline. Her trade routes that ran along the western coast of Italy crossed the river, and at this point, the river was easy to get across. People from Latium began to settle on the hills that overlooked this area. And a colony of Latin people established a village on the Palatine Hill near the Tiber River. And then soon others founded a lot of different cities that were also on the surrounding hills. And sometime during the 8th century BC, 7 of these villages formed the League of Seven Hills. And this was the beginning of the city of Rome. So, like the Greeks, the Romans developed legends to explain their history. So, according to Roman tradition, Rome was founded in 753 BC by twin brothers named Romulus and Remus. And one version of the legend tells how a relative of the twins usurped the throne and ordered the two babies who were royal descendants to be drowned. And then the infants were placed in a basket and thrown into the Tiber River to die. But a wolf saved the boys and cared for them until a shepherd found them and took them in. And as young men, Romulus and Remus allegedly returned to found a city near the place where the wolf had discovered them. And while marking out the boundaries for the city, Romulus kills Remus in a burst of jealous anger. And Romulus was said to have founded the city of Rome, named it after himself, and became the first king. Whew, that's quite the drama, isn't it, for just a little paragraph story. But that's the original story that we have. Sorry. So let's talk about early society and government. The basic unit of early Roman society was the family, and this should start to feel repetitious because we've seen this with all sorts of others societies. Family is the building block. Family is the first building block. And that theme is purposeful because we know that that is God's design. family is the building block of society, right? Out of the three institutions that God ordained, family, government, and church, family is the core one, the first one. So it's not a surprise that we see that in every culture that family is the first building block, the basic unit of society. So the family often consisted of a small community that was very self-sufficient and self-ruled. It included not only, the father, wife, and children, but also all the people who lived in the household, such as slaves. Um, and it was kind of weird that even in Latin mindset, even property was considered to be part of the family. The father was the sole authority of the family, and his control extended to every aspect of family life. He ruled his family without interference from the state. Romans took great pride in their family heritage. Parents taught their children the value of loyalty, submission to authority, self-control, and duty. Rome's strong families, coupled with the patriotism and hardworking spirit of its people, provided the foundation for its greatness. And the families also provided the basis for larger social groups. So a number of these families from a common ancestor altogether, they called a clan, C-L-A-N, clan. And then the clans would unite over common belief and maybe living in a particular region, and they would call themselves a tribe. So early Roman society consisted of two social classes as well, and they differed greatly from each other in social and political privilege. The wealthy landholders or noble families made up the aristocratic class, and we call those the patricians. And they held the highest positions in Roman society. But the majority of the people would be in the other class, the so-called inferior class that they called the plebeians. And this was the common folks, the farmers, the traders, the craftsmen. Now, the early Roman government was a monarchy, and the king served as the chief priest as well, the commander of the army, and the administrator of justice. So the king's authority was everywhere, and um, his power, his all-consuming power, was represented by I think you call this a fasces, 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 and it was so his power was represented by a small bundle of rods, which enclosed an axe. And like that was his power. Like he had power and in every single area. So that's early Roman society. Now we're going to move into its republic's status, the early Roman Republic. So, about a century after the founding of Rome, the Etruscans crossed the Tiber River from the north and conquered the Latin villages. And during the period of Etruscan rule, Rome grew from a weak league of villages to become the leading Latin city. And as Rome's influence increased, so did the Romans nobility's hatred for the Etruscan monarch. And so in 509 BC, we see that they overthrow the king and establish a new form of government called a republic. And under the Roman Republic, the administration of the government was divided among three governing branches: the consuls, the Senate, and the assemblies. And they had two elected consuls. Consuls were kind of like, think like two presidents. The consul's job was to replace the king. And then they supervised the everyday affairs of the government and commanded the Roman army, things like that. And then the power supposedly was equally divided between the consuls, and one could not act without the other's consent. Um, so the consuls are kind of serving as like a president status. And they only got to serve for 1 year, and that was purposeful. They wanted a short term to prevent any one consul becoming too powerful. Then you have the Senate, and that they became the most important and most powerful body of the Republic. So although the Senate was intended to serve the interests of all the people in Rome, it soon became an aristocratic body that safeguarded the patricians' class. Um, the Senate had 300 members, and they were appointed for life. So very different than the consul. And the permanency of the Senate is really what increased its power beyond just an advisory role. And it had control of the money and passing laws, things like that. The Republic also had an assembly through which the people could express their views. So wealth, birth, and the place of one's residence determine the membership and voting procedures for different assemblies. But the chief assembly that I want you to know about was the Assembly of Centuries. This assembly voted on legislation submitted by the consuls, made declarations of war, and elected high-ranking government officials. So they had a decent amount of power, but the only thing was the Senate had veto power over the Assembly of the Centuries. So that was like what stunted their power sometimes. So we've got the consuls, the Senate, and the Assembly of the Centuries. Um, and this is one of the first times in history we see the government of a republic enacted and tried to live out. Now, remember, a republic is different than a democracy because of rule of law. So a democracy is very much like we vote and whoever has the majority wins. Okay? Republic might have some checks and balances on majority power, some things to temper the power of the majority, and it always has the principle that no one is above the law. Even the king or consul, no one is above the law. The law applies to everyone. So republics have rule of law. So what kind of struggles do we start to see with this new republic? Well, the patricians or the nobles that had expelled the Etruscan king, they took firm control of the government and they controlled the Senate and the assemblies and made most of the laws and controlled the courts. And in contrast, the plebeians had very few social privileges, and virtually they didn't have a voice in government. So they were really excluded from the holding public office, and marriage between plebeians and patricians was forbidden. So, and if you couldn't pay your debts, then a plebeian could lose their property and even be sold into debt slavery. So, for 2 centuries following the founding of the Republic, the plebeians really struggled to gain equality. And during those 2 centuries, Rome was constantly waging war against its neighbors. But the patricians could not handle that burden of war alone. They had to rely more and more on the people to help them fight the wars. But the plebeians uh, didn't really want to fight. They were like they didn't see any advantages or not many in fighting their neighbors. So they shared kind of this common sensation of there's a danger of fighting. And what we really want is to share the privileges of governing. So by threatening to desert the army, the plebeians gradually gained concessions from the patricians. And one of the first concessions that they gained was the right to have their own assembly and elect officials. So they met as the Council of Plebeians and passed resolutions, and then these were binding on the plebeians. However, but they weren't binding on the patrician class. Um, so the Council of Plebeians passed, wait, sorry, let me get here. Mhm. So the Council of Plebeians elected 10 men to the office of tribune, and the tribunes protected the rights and interests of the common people. They would cry things like, I veto, or sorry, veto, which means I forbid, and the tribunes could stop unjust acts from patrician officials. Um, So we see this continuing pressure from the plebeians, and it finally forced the patricians to put the Roman laws into writing. Because one of the things that they would do is they would say something was a law and apply it to the plebeians, but it wasn't actually on the books. So, it was like, hey, how can you punish me for something that I didn't even know was a law? So the plebeians said, you have to write down the law. That's not okay for you to just say this is the law. It's like someone making up a rule in a game and you're like in the middle of the game when it's to their advantage. It's like, no, no, that's not how this works. That is not that is not what we do when we have integrity, and it is not equitable. So, around 450 BC, these laws were written down on 12 tablets and they were hung in the Roman Forum, which was like the section of the city that was the center of government. And now all could actually know the law, and the law could be applied equally to all. And these tablets of law are called the Law of the 12 Tables. And this became the foundation of Roman civil law. And the Law of 12 Tables will have a huge impact on all republics in the future as well. So, gradually, the plebeians improved their political and social standing in the Republic. They gained the right to hold public office, which had previously only been held by patricians, and a few plebeians even became senators. So 450 BC is when we see a big shift. Debtor slavery is abolished, and the law against intermarriage is repealed. And then in 287 BC, the plebeian assembly is now called the tribal assembly, gained the power to pass laws binding upon all the people of Rome, including the patricians. And the distinction between the patricians and the plebeians begins to disappear. And we start to see, though, a new class distinction. So no longer is it like a caste system type thing, what family you come from. We see that it's rich versus poor. It becomes a socioeconomic division. You have wealthy plebeians and patricians that form a new alliance to maintain control of the Senate and hold the reins of power in the Republic. Ooh. So the divisions in society changed. Now, when we come back, we'll be talking about the expansion of the Republic as well as the Punic Wars. All right, so that's what's to come. So we're ending with the struggles of Rome. All right, guys, I'll see you later.